I'll never forget the first words Ernest Campbell said to me that afternoon. "Stephen, I've already seen how this ends." He stood by the empty schoolyard fence, his coat buttoned tight against the South Dakota wind, looking at the ground like something there had already passed him by. I thought he was just tired. Teachers looked that way sometimes, but the longer he stayed silent, the more I felt he was carrying something heavier than a long winter. When he finally lifted his eyes, there was no confusion in them, only a sadness that seemed older than the moment. He told me he had gone years ahead, said it softly, like he feared the words might break if he pushed them too hard. At first I didn't understand. I asked if he meant planning or worrying about the future, but he shook his head slowly. "No, I was there, Stephen. I walked in a year that hasn't come yet." I stood there frozen, trying to decide if he was joking, or unwell, or simply overwhelmed, but his voice didn't shake. His hands didn't tremble. He wasn't confused or dramatic. He spoke the way someone does when they've already spent the last of their strength on truth. He told me he had seen one of his students, an ordinary boy he'd taught for years, living a life that felt wrong in every direction, a life shaped by something Ernest himself had said. The wind picked up around us, carrying the smell of old fields and distant grain silos. Ernest looked past me as if the thing he'd seen was standing somewhere behind my shoulder. He said the boy wasn't angry in that future. That somehow made it worse. The boy was lost, drifting in a direction Ernest recognized only because he knew exactly where that path had begun. "It was my advice," he whispered. "I know it now. I should have told him it wasn't possible. I should have said no one walks into another year and returns with the weight of someone else's life on their shoulders." But something in his tone made me stay quiet. I'd never heard a man sound certain and broken at the same time. And in that moment, before the sun dipped behind the school roof, I realized Ernest wasn't asking for help. He was asking to be believed. Ernest didn't come to me because we were close. We weren't. I was just another staff member at the school, someone he'd nod to in the hallway or exchange a simple greeting with before morning duties began. The truth is, I think he chose me precisely because we weren't close. Telling a stranger is easier than disappointing a friend, or maybe he sensed I carried enough quiet in me to hold whatever he needed to say. The days before his confession had been unusually warm for late winter in South Dakota, the kind of warmth that tricks you into believing the worst of the cold is past. Students lingered longer after class, and teachers opened windows just to feel something shifting in the air. Ernest looked the same as he always did. Pressed shirt, steady posture, so I had no reason to think anything was wrong. But there were small things I only understood later. How he paused longer at the end of a lesson. How he watched certain students with a kind of distant worry. What struck me most after he spoke that first afternoon was how tired he looked. Not in his body, but somewhere deeper. He didn't ask me to solve anything. He didn't ask for advice. He simply wanted someone else to hold the truth with him for a moment. That he had stepped into a year that hadn't arrived yet, and that the life he found there wasn't the one he hoped to see. He told me the future didn't look dramatic or strange. It looked painfully ordinary, just misaligned enough that you could tell something had gone wrong quietly, long before anyone noticed. And the heart of it, he said, traced back to one conversation, one sentence, one moment he thought would help a young boy find direction. Instead, it had guided him toward a life Ernest wished he'd never witnessed. "Hi, my name is Stephen. If you're enjoying this story so far, I'd be grateful if you subscribe to the channel. Have you ever wondered how a single moment can shape an entire life? Thank you for being here with me. Now let's return to the story." I didn't sleep well the night after Ernest told me what he had seen. I kept waking up before the alarm, staring at the ceiling of my small house on the edge of town, listening to the quiet hum of the heater kicking on and off. South Dakota mornings have a way of making you feel older than you are. Cold light, thin air, the sense that the day has already decided what it wants from you before you even get out of bed. That next morning, all I could think about was Ernest standing by that fence, as if he were returning from some place no one else could follow. When I arrived at the school, I expected him to avoid me, embarrassed by what he had shared, but he wasn't. He was already in his classroom, early as always, straightening desks that didn't really need straightening. The sun was just coming through the windows, coating the floor in a pale, cold glow. He looked up when I walked by, his expression calm but heavier than usual, like someone waiting for a verdict he already knew. I didn't speak to him right away. I didn't want to corner him or make him feel as if his moment of honesty had turned into a burden. But something in me felt responsible, not to fix anything, because I didn't even understand what needed fixing, but to listen again if he needed to talk. Some people carry things in a way you can see in their shoulders, their eyes, their pauses. Ernest carried it in all three. During lunch, I found him in the teacher's lounge, sitting at the far table with a cup of black coffee he hadn't touched. The lounge was always warm, almost stuffy, and decorated with old posters no one had the heart to take down. He looked up as I approached, then back at the coffee as if unsure how long he'd been holding it. "Rough night?" I asked, keeping my voice soft. He gave a small nod. "It doesn't go away when you close your eyes," he said. That's the part I didn't expect. I sat across from him. "Do you want to talk about it again?" He hesitated, just long enough for me to think he'd refuse, then exhaled slowly. "I didn't tell you everything yesterday," he said. "It didn't seem fair to put it all on you at once." He set the coffee down. His hands were steady. His voice wasn't. "I didn't end up far," he continued. "Just a few years ahead. 4, maybe 5. It wasn't dramatic, no bright light, no feeling of being pulled or pushed. I was here, in this same building, but older, dustier. The halls felt quieter, like something had settled over the place." He paused, and I could tell he was choosing his next words carefully. "I saw him in the far hallway," he said. "The student I've been telling you about. He didn't see me. He walked past like I wasn't there. He looked older, of course, but not in the way people get older naturally. More like he had spent too long in a life that didn't suit him." I didn't interrupt. He seemed grateful for that. I followed him outside. Ernest continued. "Not close, just enough to understand the shape of his life. He worked at a place I recognized, a store some of the students pick up shifts at after school. But he wasn't just working. He was stuck there, like he'd never left town, like he'd never taken a single step past what he thought he deserved." Ernest rubbed one hand over his forehead, and I knew exactly when it started. A talk we had, a small one. Something I told him about being realistic, about not chasing ideas that didn't fit where he came from. He let out a breath, shaky and thin. "I thought I was helping him understand the world," he said. "But when I saw him in that future, he looked like someone who had given up before he ever tried." He lifted his eyes to me then, and for the first time since he began telling me these things, I saw something sharper than sadness. "I didn't just see his future, Stephen," he said quietly. "I saw the weight of my voice inside it, and I don't know what to do with that." I didn't have an answer. Not yet. But something in me knew this was only the beginning of whatever Ernest had stepped into. The rest of that school day moved like it usually did, but it felt thinner somehow, like the moments didn't have as much weight as they used to. Bells rang, lockers slammed, students laughed in the hallways, and still my mind kept circling back to Ernest sitting in that cramped lounge, talking about a future only he had walked through. I told myself I would give him some space. People can drown in concern just as easily as in silence. But a part of me stayed alert to where he was, the way you do when you know someone nearby is quietly breaking and trying not to show it. Between classes, I saw him standing at his doorway, watching the students file past. His eyes weren't on all of them. They followed one boy in particular. I recognized the kid. His name was Ryan. 16 maybe. Dark hair that never really stayed where it was combed. He wasn't popular or invisible, just one of those students who sits near the middle of every room, close enough to follow the lesson, far enough to not be called on too much. He carried a worn backpack and walked with the careful step of someone who doesn't want to bump into anyone or be noticed for the wrong reason. As Ryan passed, Ernest's gaze tightened, just slightly. Not anger, not fear, something closer to regret waiting for its turn to speak. Ryan didn't look at him. He barely glanced into the room. Later that afternoon, I had a short break while my class worked on an assignment, so I stepped out into the hall under the excuse of needing fresh air. I won't pretend that's why I really went out there. I was looking for Ernest. I found him near the end of the corridor, leaning against the wall beside a row of old trophy cases, pretending to read the faded nameplates. "You're watching him, aren't you?" I asked, keeping my voice low. "The boy from your story." He didn't look surprised that I knew. Maybe he'd already accepted that once you speak something out loud, it becomes harder to hide. "Yes," he said. "That's him." We both watched as Ryan turned the corner at the far end, heading toward the exit. His shoulders were slightly hunched, like the weight he carried was more about thoughts than books. "Did you talk to him today?" I asked. "Not yet," Ernest replied. "In the future, I saw, we only spoke once in any meaningful way. That conversation happened around this time of year, and I mishandled it." He closed his eyes for a second, just long enough for the fluorescent lights overhead to flash across his eyelids. "What did you tell him?" I asked. Ernest hesitated. "It wasn't cruel. That's the worst part. I thought I was being honest. He talked about leaving town, going somewhere bigger, studying something that didn't fit with what his family expected of him. I told him to be realistic, to consider staying near home, helping with what was already there. I made it sound wise. He swallowed. He believed me. We stood there in silence. A group of students passed behind us, laughing about something that probably wouldn't matter in a week, but felt loud and important in that moment. When their voices faded, Ernest spoke again. When I went ahead, he said quietly, "I found him still here. Same town, same store, same look in his eyes. Not misery, just a sort of tired acceptance, as if he'd never once tested whether his life could be different. Maybe it wouldn't have worked out," I offered, though the words felt weak, even if he'd tried. "That's not the point," Ernest said, shaking his head. "It wasn't my place to take the trying away from him. A teacher's words carry farther than we think. In that future, I could feel mine in the way he moved, the way he talked about himself. He had learned to lower his expectations, and I was the one who handed him the lesson." I leaned against the opposite wall, facing him. "Why tell me this?" I asked. "Why not the principal, or a counselor, or someone who can do more than listen?" He gave a sad, crooked half smile. "Because you don't look at people like they're problems to solve," he said. "You listen first. I needed someone who wouldn't treat this like a report or a symptom." His eyes grew distant again, and I needed to say it out loud before it becomes fixed. Before that future hardens into the only version of him, there was something in that sentence that settled into me. Before it becomes fixed. It made the whole situation feel like wet cement, still soft enough to change shape, but only for a while. "Ernest," I said slowly, "when you were there, in that year ahead, did you see anything else? Anything that told you how you got there? Why you were sent or how you returned?" He looked at me for a long moment, and I realized this was the question he'd been waiting for me to ask. "Yes," he said. "There was one thing, and I think it's the reason I can't ignore any of this." He didn't tell me what it was yet. The bell rang, echoing down the hall, and students began spilling from classrooms, filling the space between us with noise and motion. Whatever Ernest had started to say was swallowed by the rush of the afternoon, but I could tell from his face that when he did finally tell me, it would change how I understood every word that had come before. I didn't get a chance to speak to Ernest again until long after the final bell. The school emptied slowly that day, the way it often does when winter is easing its grip and students linger outdoors just a little longer. I stayed behind in my classroom, pretending to organize papers, though my mind kept drifting back to the unfinished sentence he'd tried to give me earlier. There was one thing, and I think it's the reason I can't ignore any of this. The words stayed with me like a quiet echo. As the hall settled into silence, I finally stepped out and made my way toward the faculty exit. The sky outside had turned a pale gold, the kind that arrives just before a cold evening settles over South Dakota. I was halfway across the parking lot when I saw him. Ernest was sitting on the small concrete ledge near the old flagpole, elbows on his knees, staring at the ground as though the answers he wanted were somewhere in the gravel. He didn't look up when I approached. I sat beside him without saying anything. For a moment, we just watched the shadows stretch across the pavement. "You said there was something else," I reminded him softly. He nodded once. "I've been trying to decide if it matters," he said, "but I think it does." I waited, giving him time. "When I went ahead," he continued, "I didn't see myself. Not directly, but there were signs I had been there." He paused, exhaling slowly. "In that future, someone had left a note inside my classroom desk, folded neatly, placed where I would find it." My breath caught slightly. "What did it say?" "I didn't open it," he said. "I knew it wasn't mine, but I recognized the handwriting." He turned toward me then, and for the first time since this began, his voice carried a faint tremor. It was Ryan's. The name settled between us like dust. not heavy but impossible to ignore. "You're sure?" I asked. "As sure as I am of anything," he replied. His handwriting has a slight lean to the left. He presses harder on the first letter of a sentence than the last. I've graded enough of his assignments to recognize it anywhere. A quiet gust of wind blew across the lot, carrying a few loose leaves skittering past our feet. "What do you think the note was?" I asked. "I don't know," he said, "but he placed it there for a reason, and in that future I wasn't around to read it. That's the part that keeps me awake." I frowned. "You weren't around?" He shook his head. "I didn't see any sign of me. No mention, no papers, nothing that suggested I was still at the school. It's like I had stepped out of that world entirely." The idea made my chest tighten, not because I feared for him, but because I could see the shape of his worry. This sense that he had glimpsed not just the boy's future, but his own absence from it. "Maybe you transferred," I offered gently, "or retired early, or—" "No," he said calmly. "It didn't feel like that. The space felt wrong, like something had shifted in a way it wasn't supposed to. And the note, I think it was left after I was gone." He rubbed his forehead again, slower this time, as if piecing the thought together hurt. "I've been thinking," he said, "if I changed his future with one conversation, maybe I changed my own as well." We sat still for a moment, letting that settle. I didn't know what to say. He wasn't asking for comfort. He wasn't even asking for advice. He was laying out the truth as he understood it, one piece at a time, hoping it would make sense when spoken aloud. Finally he stood, brushing dust from his coat. "I'm going to talk to him tomorrow," he said. "Not to fix anything, not to shape anything, just to listen. I think that's what I failed to do before." His voice softened. "If the future I saw was real, then maybe there's still time to shift its weight." I rose with him, the cold evening settling around us. The parking lot was empty, the school behind us, quiet and dim. "Do you want me there?" I asked. He hesitated, not from uncertainty, but from the difficulty of accepting help. "Yes," he said at last. "I think I might." We walked to our cars without speaking. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the sky washed in muted pink and gray. As I watched Ernest drive away, a thought pressed against my mind, quiet but persistent. Whatever he planned for tomorrow, it wouldn't just change the boy's path, it would change his, and maybe mine too. The next morning, I arrived at the school earlier than usual. The hallways were still dim, lit only by the scattered glow of maintenance lights that hummed softly above the empty corridors. A thin layer of frost clung to the bottom edges of the windows, turning the building into something quiet and half asleep. I wasn't sure what Ernest planned to say to Ryan, or even how he would begin, but something in me knew this day mattered more than either of us could fully understand. I found Ernest in his classroom, sitting at his desk with his hands clasped together. He looked calm, not in the way someone finds peace, but in the way a person braces themselves before they step into cold water. His coat hung neatly on the back of his chair, and a stack of ungraded assignments sat untouched beside him. "You made it," he said, offering a faint smile. "I said I would," I replied. "How are you feeling?" He considered the question. "Like I'm about to walk into a version of myself I haven't met yet," he said. "But I'm ready." There was something steady in his voice, something quiet but certain. I wondered if this was how he had sounded on the day he'd told Ryan to be realistic, confident, sure of his own wisdom, certain he was guiding the boy toward something safe. The bell for early arrival rang softly, echoing down the hall as students began drifting inside. Their footsteps were light, careless, full of the energy mornings always seemed to give to the young. Ernest stood, straightened his tie, and glanced at the doorway. "He usually passes by around now," he said. We didn't have to wait long. A minute later, Ryan appeared, heading down the hallway with his usual slow, careful steps. His backpack hung from one shoulder, and he kept his eyes on the ground in front of him, as if mapping out each footstep before taking it. Ernest stepped into the doorway. "Ryan," he called gently. The boy stopped, startled. He looked up quickly, adjusting the strap on his backpack, clearly unsure if he was in trouble. "Yes, sir?" he asked. "Do you have a minute?" Ernest asked. Ryan hesitated. I could see the uncertainty flicker across his face. Not fear, just the natural caution of a student approached unexpectedly by a teacher. Sure," he said quietly. Ernest stepped back, letting him enter. I remained near the door, not wanting to intrude, but Ernest gestured to the spare chair near his desk. "Stephen's fine to stay," he said. "He's just here to listen." I nodded at the boy, offering a small, reassuring smile. Ryan returned it shyly before sitting down. Ernest pulled a chair a little closer. Not too close, just enough to make it clear the moment mattered. "I wanted to check on you," Ernest began. "You've been on my mind." Ryan shifted, confused. "Me? Did I do something wrong?" "No," Ernest said gently. "Not at all. I just think I owe you a better conversation than the one we had a while back." Ryan's eyes softened with recognition, as if recalling something small he'd tucked away. "Oh," he said. "You mean that talk we had after class? About my plans?" Ernest nodded. "Yes, that one." Ryan sat up straighter. "I remember. You said I should be realistic, that it's better not to aim too high." Ernest winced, not visibly, but in the space between breaths. "I was wrong," he said simply. Ryan blinked, caught off guard. "Wrong?" "Yes," Ernest said. "I spoke from my own fears, not yours. I didn't listen to what you wanted. I didn't ask what you hoped for. I just assumed I knew what would keep you safe." Ryan stared at him, stunned. It was rare for a teacher to admit fault, rarer still to speak in a way that sounded so deeply personal. "You didn't have to say that," Ryan murmured. "I mean, I thought you were trying to help." "I was," Ernest replied, "but I didn't help the right part of you." The room fell quiet. A soft hum from the heating vents filled the space between words. "What did you want back then?" Ernest asked. Ryan looked down at his hands. "I wanted to leave town, to study mechanics, maybe engineering. I didn't think anyone here would understand." "I wish I'd asked you more about that," Ernest said. "I wish I'd listened instead of steering you." Ryan nodded slowly. I could see a small change in him. Nothing dramatic, just a shift in the way his shoulders sat, as if something long held in place had loosened slightly. "It's not too late," Ernest said. "Not for any of that." The boy's eyes lifted. There was something uncertain there, but also a hint of something else, something almost like hope. "Thank you, sir," he said quietly. "That means more than you know." Ernest exhaled, a breath that sounded like he'd been holding it for years. When Ryan stood and left the room, the air felt lighter. But Ernest didn't look relieved. He looked unsettled, as if the moment had given him something he didn't expect. "What is it?" I asked. He looked at the doorway where Ryan had disappeared. "In the future I saw," he said softly. "That conversation never happened." And the way he said it made me realize what he feared now wasn't the future he'd seen. It was the one that might replace it. For the rest of the morning, Ernest moved through his classes with a quiet steadiness that didn't match the storm I knew was turning inside him. He taught the lesson, wrote on the board with his usual careful handwriting, and responded to questions with the patient tone he was known for. But there were moments, small ones, where he paused just a second too long before speaking, as if the present felt slightly out of alignment with what he remembered of the future. During my own classes, I found it difficult to focus. Every time I tried to settle into a routine, my mind drifted back to what Ernest had said. In the future, I saw, that conversation never happened. There was something unsettling about that idea. Not the notion of seeing another year, but the implication that the moment he shared with Ryan that morning wasn't part of the timeline he had walked through. It was new, something he hadn't lived yet, something he had changed. When lunch break came, I stepped into the hallway just as Ernest was locking his classroom door. The students had already dispersed toward the cafeteria, leaving the corridor quiet except for the hum of fluorescent lights. "How are you doing?" I asked. He gave a small shrug. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I keep waiting for something to feel different." "Did the conversation feel right?" He nodded. "Yes, it felt like something I should have said years ago. But part of me keeps wondering, if that moment wasn't in the future I saw, then what else is changing around it?" We walked together toward the lounge, the sound of our footsteps echoing off the polished floor. Ernest pushed open the door, and the warm air inside greeted us with the smell of stale coffee and the faint scent of microwaved soup. A few teachers sat scattered around the room, talking quietly. Their voices faded into background noise as Ernest and I settled at a small table near the window. "Can you tell me more about that future?" I asked. "Not just about Ryan, about anything else you remember." He stared at the tabletop for a long moment, tracing the edge of a paper napkin with his fingertip. "It wasn't a dream," he said finally. "I know that much. Everything had weight. Everything had sound. I walked through this building the way I'm sitting in it now. And you were alone? Yes, he said. At least in the parts I saw, the school felt less alive, like it was running on habit instead of energy. Classrooms were ordered but untouched. Hallways were clean but lonely. It felt like a place that had kept going while losing pieces of itself. I felt a chill, not from fear, but from recognition. I'd seen schools like that before, ones where the heart of the place dimmed without anyone noticing. What about you? I asked gently. You said you didn't see any sign of yourself. He nodded. Nothing. Not a name on a door. Not a pile of papers waiting for grading. Not even a photograph in the hallway displays. It's like I had been erased. Not removed, not transferred, just gone. He rubbed his hands together, not from cold, but from the discomfort of the memory. I think something happened to me before that year, he said. Something that kept me from reaching it. I leaned forward. Do you think that's connected to Ryan? Everything felt connected, Ernest said. Not just to him, but to the choices I made around that time. The advice I gave, the conversations I avoided, the days I stayed late. It all carried weight in that future, like threads leading to places I couldn't see. He paused, looking toward the window. Outside, a few students crossed the courtyard, their laughter floating faintly across the snow-dusted pavement. When I stood in that building, he continued, I had this strange feeling that the future wasn't fixed yet, like I was seeing a version of the world that was still deciding itself. A possibility, I said. Yes, he murmured. A possibility. One that felt fragile and incomplete. We sat in silence for a moment. The lounge felt warmer than before, almost stifling, as if the room itself were trying to contain too many unspoken things. And the note? I asked quietly. The one you found in your desk? His jaw tightened slightly. It wasn't just a note, he said. It was folded the way students fold something they're scared to share. And the paper, it looked worn, like it had been opened and closed too many times. Do you think he meant to give it to you in this timeline? I don't know, he said. But he wrote it in the future I visited, and that means at some point he tried to reach me, even when I wasn't there. There was something deeply unsettling about that idea. A message written for a teacher who didn't exist anymore, left in a desk that belonged to no one. What are you afraid of now? I asked. Ernest looked at me, eyes heavy but steady. That I changed something without understanding what comes next, he said, and that the future I saw isn't done with me yet. The rest of the afternoon unfolded slowly, as if time itself had decided to thicken around us. My final class ended with the usual shuffle of students gathering their books and rushing toward the promise of the end-of-day bell. When the hallway finally fell quiet again, I found myself drifting back toward Ernest's classroom almost on instinct. I wasn't sure if he would still be there, but part of me felt a pull, as if whatever was happening to him wasn't meant to be carried alone. His door was open just a few inches. Soft light from the late afternoon sun spilled across the floorboards, stretching long shadows from the desks. I knocked gently before stepping inside. Ernest was sitting at his desk, the same place where he had seen that future version of the room, elbows resting on a stack of papers he wasn't really looking at. His expression wasn't distressed, just distant, as if his thoughts had wandered someplace far beyond the walls around us. You okay? I asked. He blinked, returning to himself. I've been going over the day, he said, trying to understand how a single conversation can change the air around you. I took a seat in the front row, turning the chair slightly so I could face him. The room felt strangely still, like the pause between a question and its answer. What do you mean? I asked. I keep thinking about the boy I saw in that future, he said. He wasn't angry. He wasn't even sad. He was quiet, like someone who learned early not to trust hope. And today, when I spoke to him, for one brief moment, I saw something shift in his eyes. Just the smallest spark. He exhaled, slow and unsteady. It made the future I saw feel even heavier, because it means something can change, but it also means something must have gone wrong before it ever could. I let that sit in the room between us. Sometimes the weight of a truth needs a moment to settle before it can be understood. Do you think you were meant to see that future? I asked. He thought about that for a long moment. I don't know if meant to is the right way to think about it, he said, but I do know this. It didn't feel like an accident. It felt like something I was allowed to witness for a reason. What reason? To understand the cost of my voice, he said, and maybe to understand what happens when I'm no longer here to use it. A quiet pause followed. Outside, a gust of wind rattled one of the windows, the glass trembling gently in its frame. I've been wondering, he continued, if the version of me in that future, the one who wasn't here anymore, was someone shaped by the same choices I made with Ryan. If my absence wasn't an event, but a consequence. The idea unsettled me, not because it suggested something tragic, but because it felt eerily plausible. Choices don't only shape futures, sometimes they erase possibilities. What if you're overthinking it? I offered gently. What if the future is just messy? What if you're reading too much into coincidences? He shook his head. Stephen, everything I saw aligned too perfectly, not dramatically, just quietly, in ways that felt deliberate, like the world was nudging me toward something I'd ignored too long. His eyes slid toward the empty desk at the back of the room, the one he always kept open for tutoring sessions, though I realized suddenly that I'd never actually seen a student sit there. Do you want to know the hardest part? He asked. Tell me. He looked back at me with a tired, almost frightened honesty. I didn't feel any sense of time passing when I was there, he said. None. It was like stepping into a moment that had already been waiting for me. Like the future wasn't ahead but beside me, close enough to touch if I turned the right way. A faint shiver ran down my spine. Not fear, just the unsettling recognition that time can feel different for reasons we don't understand. What do you think happens next? I asked. He leaned back in his chair, folding his hands. I think, he said slowly, that today was the first step towards something I haven't seen yet, something separate from the future I walked through. And that scares you? He nodded. Because if the future can change, then so can the consequences. We sat quietly, the late sunlight dimming inch by inch across the desks. And Stephen, he added softly, I don't think I'm finished with whatever pulled me forward in the first place. There was something in his voice, a quiet certainty, that made the room feel smaller, as if the air itself was listening. I think, he said, looking past me toward the hallway, that it's going to happen again. I didn't expect the next day to feel different, but it did. The moment I stepped outside that morning, the air felt heavier, like the cold had thickened overnight. A soft layer of frost covered the grass, the kind that crunches quietly under your shoes, but melts the moment sunlight touches it. I drove to the school with the radio off, letting the silence settle. Something Ernest said kept turning in my mind. I think it's going to happen again. Those words followed me through every turn in the road. When I arrived, the parking lot was nearly empty. Teachers rarely came this early unless they had a reason. I noticed Ernest's car immediately, parked slightly crooked, as if he had stepped out of it too quickly or arrived with his thoughts ahead of his body. The windshield was still fogged along the bottom edge, catching the first hints of morning light. I found him inside, just past the main entrance, standing in the hallway as though he'd forgotten why he'd stopped walking. His coat was still on, unbuttoned, and his hands hung at his sides. He didn't look distressed, just out of place, like someone who had stepped into a room expecting to find something that wasn't there. Ernest? I called gently. He turned slowly, focusing on me with a delayed clarity. Stephen, he said, breathing out as if relieved to see something familiar. I wasn't sure if I'd see you this morning. What does that mean? He looked down the empty hallway toward his classroom, then back at me. I woke up feeling like part of today had already happened, he said. Not a memory, more like an echo. I stepped closer. Did you see anything? Did it happen again? No, he said, but I think it's close. He finally shrugged off his coat and draped it over his arm. The movement grounded him a little, pulling him back into the present. He started walking toward his classroom, and I walked beside him, the hallway lights flickering on as the motion sensors woke up. When we reached his door, he paused with his hand on the knob. Last night, he said quietly, I kept thinking about the note, the one in my desk. I can still see it so clearly, even though I never opened it. I waited. He continued. It was folded in a way that felt deliberate, like someone had taken time with each crease. I keep trying to imagine what Ryan wanted to tell me, what version of him needed to write something he couldn't say. And do you think you'll get that note here, in this timeline? He shook his head. I don't know. I don't know if the future I saw is still out there waiting for me, or if I stepped out of reach the moment I talked to him yesterday. He pushed the door open slowly. The classroom was dark, but familiar. Desks neatly arranged, chalk waiting on the ledge. His old wooden desk in the corner, the one he'd mentioned finding the note in. The room carried the faint smell of paper, dry air, and the lingering cold of an early morning. He walked to the desk, hesitating before pulling the chair back. "I didn't want to look," he said. "Not until you got here." "For what?" "For anything that shouldn't be there." He opened the top drawer. It slid smoothly, revealing the usual clutter. Pens, extra worksheets, a few paper clips. Nothing strange, nothing folded, nothing waiting. He released a breath he'd been holding, though it didn't bring relief, only uncertainty. "I think the future is shifting," he said. "It feels thinner now, less solid, like I touched something I wasn't supposed to." I leaned against the nearest desk. "Ernest, do you think this is happening to you or because of you?" He looked at me, eyes clouded with a mixture of fear and responsibility. "Both," he said. Before I could respond, footsteps echoed faintly in the hallway. Early students arriving, the building slowly waking. Ernest straightened his posture and closed the drawer. "I need to teach," he said. "If something happens today, you'll know." And I did know, because something in him seemed stretched between two versions of the day, one he remembered and one he hadn't lived yet. When the first student walked in, smiling and greeting him casually, Ernest smiled back, but his eyes drifted toward the window, toward the horizon beyond it, as if he expected the future to come walking up the path at any moment. And for a brief second, I felt it too, like time was rearranging itself just out of view. For most of the morning, Ernest managed to keep himself anchored to the routine of teaching. He moved through lessons with a calm steadiness, pausing only once in a while when his eyes drifted to the windows or to the hallway beyond his door. I checked in on him between classes, but he always gave the same quiet assurance. "I'm all right, I'm here." It was the way he said that last part that unsettled me, like he wasn't entirely convinced he'd stay that way. By midday, the weather outside had shifted. Clouds had settled over the sky in a soft, muted sheet, dimming the light in every classroom. Students grew quieter as the day went on, the gray sky pressing gently on everyone's mood. At lunch, I found Ernest standing alone near the row of vending machines, his hands in his pockets, staring at the far wall as if trying to remember whether it had always looked that way. "You look like someone who forgot where he's supposed to be," I said carefully. He didn't flinch. "That's exactly it," he replied. "Every time the bell rings, I feel a pull, like I'm supposed to be walking somewhere else, like I'm late for something I don't remember." "Do you think the future is trying to pull you back?" I asked. He considered it. "Not back," he said. "Forward. It's like the timeline I stepped into still expects me, like it hasn't closed around my absence." That thought tightened something in my chest. Ernest wasn't speaking like a man imagining things. He was describing them the way someone describes a memory they can't shake. Before I could respond, a group of students passed by, laughing about something that made them forget the heaviness of the day. Ernest watched them, his expression softening for a moment. "Do you know what frightened me most in that future?" he asked. "No, I didn't feel out of place there," he said quietly. Everything felt familiar, as if I had already lived the days leading up to it, even though I know I haven't. That admission lingered between us, a subtle, unnerving crack in the shape of time. After lunch, we parted to return to our classrooms. My students worked on an assignment while I drifted toward the window, watching the gray sky blend with the pale horizon. Something about the day felt stretched thin, as if events were layered atop one another, some fully real, others waiting for their turn. By the last class, the air had grown colder, and the light outside dimmed as though evening had arrived early. When the final bell rang, I stepped into the hallway again and felt a strange tension that hadn't been there earlier. Students hurried by, bundling in jackets, eager to head home before snow began to fall. I looked for Ernest. I found him halfway down the corridor, standing completely still. His arms hung loosely at his sides. His face was pale, but not from fear, more from a kind of disorientation, as though he'd just stepped into a room that wasn't the one he thought he was entering. "Ernest?" I called out gently. He didn't answer at first. Instead, he looked toward his classroom door, then toward the far end of the hall. His focus shifted between the 2 points as if he were seeing both the present and something else layered over it. "Are you okay?" I asked, approaching him carefully. He blinked, finally pulling himself back. I think something just happened. My heart tightened. What do you mean? I was walking toward my room, he said, and suddenly everything felt different. The hall looked the same, but it didn't feel the same. For a moment, it was as if I had stepped back into that future. Not fully, just the surface of it. Like an overlap? I asked. Yes, he whispered, like the world shifted under my feet for a second. I looked around. Nothing seemed unusual. Students were leaving, lockers were slamming, teachers were gathering their things. Yet something in the air carried a faint electric stillness. What did you see? I asked. It wasn't what I saw, he said. It was what I didn't see. His eyes grew distant, focused, but unsettled. In that moment, he said, I didn't see Ryan in the hall, and he should have been there. He's always here at this time, walking out with the others. We both turned toward the flow of students moving past. Ryan wasn't among them. I scanned the hallway, expecting him to appear around a corner, but he didn't. Maybe he left early, I suggested gently. Maybe, Ernest said, but his tone told me he didn't believe that. He kept watching the empty space at the far end of the hall, the place where he expected to see Ryan appear, the place where time had briefly shifted beneath him, and the silence around us deepened, as if the building itself knew something had changed and wasn't ready to reveal what it was. The hallway emptied slowly, the way it always did near the end of the day, but there was something different about the quiet that followed. It wasn't just the absence of noise, it was the absence of presence. A kind of hollowness settled in the air, as if a single missing student had shifted the balance of the building. Ernest stood completely still. His eyes stayed fixed on the end of the corridor, where he expected Ryan to appear. I watched him for a moment, unsure if speaking would steady him or break whatever fragile sense of focus he was holding on to. He could have taken another exit, I said softly. Ryan doesn't do that, Ernest replied. He's consistent. Same hallway, same timing, every day. His voice wasn't anxious, just sure, the same way he'd sounded when telling me about the future. I stepped closer. Do you think this is connected to what happened earlier, when you felt the hallway shift? He slowly exhaled. I don't think it's a coincidence. We stood together in the quiet, letting the weight of that settle. Eventually, I decided we should check his classroom again, just in case Ryan had stopped by for some reason. Ernest didn't move at first, but when I touched his arm gently, he nodded and walked with me toward the door. Inside, the room was exactly as it had been that morning. Neat. Still, familiar. But the air felt slightly colder, as if someone had opened a window recently and closed it again before we arrived. Ernest walked straight to his desk and pulled the chair aside, and then he froze. Stephen, he said quietly. I moved to his side, my heart already tightening. Sitting in the corner of the desk drawer, impossible to miss, was a sheet of paper, folded, crisp, waiting, folded exactly the way Ernest had described the note from the future. My breath caught. He didn't touch it at first. He just stared at it with a kind of stunned recognition, as if time itself had reached out and placed it there gently. After a long moment, he lifted it with both hands. The paper made a faint sound as it unfolded, the creases sharp and new. There were only 4 words written inside. I didn't go home. A single line. No signature, no explanation. But I saw it in Ernest's face. The recognition, the certainty. Ryan wrote this, he whispered. I swallowed. Are you sure? I know his handwriting, he said. And this is his. My mind raced. Maybe he left it during lunch or after class. No, Ernest said quietly. He didn't come into my classroom today. Not once. I would have seen him. He set the note gently on the desk, as if it were fragile. The room felt colder suddenly, as if something had shifted inside it, something small but undeniable. Does this match the moment you saw in the future? I asked. The note in your desk? Ernest shook his head, his eyes distant. No, in the future, the paper looked older, worn. This one is new. So this is another note, a different one. Yes. A silence settled between us, uncomfortable but honest. Ernest stepped back from the desk, rubbing his forehead. It's happening differently, he said. Not the way I saw it. Not the same timeline. The future I walked into. It's not the only one. The thought unsettled me deeply. What do you think this means? I asked. I think, he said slowly, that whatever pulled me forward is shifting the pieces around me now. The conversation I had with Ryan wasn't part of the future I saw, and now this note isn't the note I found there. He looked at the paper again, jaw tightening just a fraction. I didn't go home, I repeated softly. What do you think he meant? Before he could answer, footsteps echoed faintly in the hallway. Slow, uneven, almost hesitant. Ernest and I both looked toward the doorway at the exact same moment. Ryan wasn't there. Instead, the hallway beyond the door was empty again. Too empty. The sound faded as quickly as it came. Ernest turned toward me, his voice low and steady in a way that sent a shiver through me. It's starting, he said. Whatever this is, it's beginning around him. He picked up the note again, holding it carefully between his fingers, and I don't think we have much time to understand why. I don't know what I expected the next day, but I knew before I even arrived that something in our small world had shifted for good. The sky was a pale, colorless gray when morning light crept across the horizon. The kind of sky that makes you feel the day isn't really beginning, just continuing something unfinished. I drove in silence again, gripping the steering wheel a little tighter than usual. The note sat in my mind like a stone. I didn't go home. I parked beside Ernest's car. His engine was still warm, exhaust fading in a thin line of vapor. He'd only just arrived, but when I entered the building, I didn't find him in the hallway or his classroom. The school felt oddly empty, as if the echoes of the day hadn't caught up yet. I found him in the far stairwell, the one that students rarely used, the one that always felt a little cooler than the rest of the building. He stood on the landing between floors, hands gripping the railing, his posture stiff and uncertain. "You okay?" I asked. He didn't turn right away. When he finally looked at me, there was something unfamiliar in his expression. Not fear, not confusion, but something like recognition of a moment he'd already lived. "It happened again," he said softly. My pulse tightened. "Tell me." "I was walking in," he said, "and for a second, I wasn't here. The hallway was the same, but older, faded, empty. And there was this sound, like someone walking just ahead of me. But when I followed it, the hall snapped back to normal." "How long did it last?" "A breath," he said. "Maybe less." We both stood there for a moment, listening to the faint hum of the heating system. The air in the stairwell felt colder than the rest of the building. "Do you think it's pulling you forward again?" I asked. He shook his head. "No. This time felt different. It wasn't just a shift. Something was overlapping, like two moments trying to exist in the same space." I stepped beside him. "Did you see anyone? Hear anything besides footsteps?" His shoulders tensed. I heard a voice, very faint. I thought it was Ryan at first, but the tone... He paused, searching for the right word. It sounded older, like someone speaking from farther away than the hallway. We stayed in that quiet, letting his words sink in. Something about the atmosphere felt thinner than usual, as if the walls were holding their breath. "We have to find him," Ernest said suddenly. "Ryan, we need to know where he went yesterday." I nodded. "Let's start with the office. Maybe he signed out early." We made our way through the hallways as the school slowly came to life. Teachers arrived, students trickled in, lockers opened and shut. It all looked normal. And yet, I felt a faint tension in the air, like a thread pulled too tight. In the main office, Mrs. Benson flipped through the sign-out sheet. "Ryan?" she repeated. "No, sweetheart. He didn't check out. Not yesterday, not today." Ernest and I exchanged a glance. "Did his parents call?" I asked. Mrs. Benson shook her head. "Not that I've seen." When we left the office, Ernest stopped abruptly in the hallway. His eyes drifted to the row of lockers on the right. Ryan's locker was among them, plain, clean, unmarked, but Ernest stepped toward it as if pulled. "What is it?" I asked. He didn't answer right away. His fingers brushed the metal door lightly. "In the future," he said quietly. "This locker wasn't here." The words hit me like a sudden temperature drop. "What do you mean?" I asked. "It was gone," he said. "Empty space. The locker stopped 2 down from here. His was missing." I felt that strange tension again. Something shifting just out of sight. "Should we open it?" I asked. "I don't think we should," he answered, though his voice didn't sound convinced. He stepped back, staring at the door like it held a secret we weren't ready for. Students began filling the corridor, blocking the lockers from view. Ernest didn't move. We'll talk to him when he comes in, I said. Today's not even fully started. But Ernest kept watching the crowd, searching every face. Stephen, he said suddenly, his voice low but certain. Look around. Really look. I scanned the hall. Students talking, laughing, moving in waves. But one face was missing. Ryan isn't here, Ernest said. And the hall, full as it was, felt strangely incomplete, as if one missing presence had left a quiet absence that only we could sense. Something was beginning, and it was happening faster now. The bell rang for first period, but neither Ernest nor I moved. Students flooded the hallway in waves, splitting around us like rocks in a stream. Their conversations bounced off the lockers, weekend plans, half-finished homework, something funny that happened on the bus. None of them noticed anything strange. None of them noticed the space where one boy should have been. But Ernest did, and by then, so did I. When the crowd finally thinned, Ernest stepped closer to Ryan's locker again, his hand hovering inches from the metal as if waiting for it to react. If he didn't sign out, he murmured, and he didn't go home. He paused, swallowing the rest of the sentence. I finished it quietly for him. Then where did he go? Ernest didn't answer. Instead, he turned and started walking. Not quickly, but with purpose, as though something inside him had aligned and was pointing him toward a place he hadn't realized he remembered. I followed without question. We passed classrooms where teachers were beginning their days, bulletin boards filled with faded announcements, the faint smell of floor polish that always lingered during winter months. He led us toward the west wing of the school, the older section, the one rarely used except for storage and the occasional overflow class. The lights here flickered more often, and the air always felt a few degrees colder. Ernest slowed his pace as we approached the far end of the hallway. This part, he said quietly, looked exactly the same in the future. We stopped outside an unused classroom whose door hadn't been opened in months. A thin layer of dust lined the bottom edge. Ernest stared at it, his expression tightening in a way I'd come to recognize, his mind pulling forward and backward at the same time. He reached for the knob, but stopped before touching it. In the future, he said, this room was locked, like something was meant to stay inside. Do you think Ryan is... No, Ernest said quickly. Not here, but I think this room matters. Before I could press him further, a faint sound came from inside. Not a voice, not footsteps. Something softer, like paper shifting. Ernest froze. We listened. The sound didn't repeat. Maybe a draft, I offered, though even I didn't believe it. Ernest didn't open the door. He backed away instead, his breath unsteady. We shouldn't touch it yet, he said. Not until we understand more. So we continued down the hallway, both of us looking back twice, as if the room was aware of being noticed. When we turned the corner, the temperature felt warmer again, and I could finally draw a full breath. We spent the rest of the morning trying to locate Ryan. Ernest checked the library, the gym, even the front office again. I spoke with a few students who sat near him in class. No one had seen him since yesterday. No one seemed to know anything at all. By lunchtime, the uncertainty had settled into Ernest's shoulders. He sat at the edge of the cafeteria, untouched tray in front of him, eyes distant. I sat beside him, waiting. The noise of the room felt strangely muted, as though the building was listening to something deeper than student chatter. Finally, he spoke. I've been thinking about the note, he said. Why those words? Why that message? I didn't reply. He wasn't asking me. He was asking himself. I didn't go home, he repeated softly. It could mean he stayed late at school, or left town, or he hesitated, or it could mean he stepped into something he couldn't return from. Do you think he went where you went? I asked gently. Ernest closed his eyes for a moment. I think time doesn't stay still when you touch it. Maybe stepping into that future didn't just show me something. Maybe it opened something. A door? I asked. A path, he whispered. And maybe Ryan found it. The idea sat heavy between us. The bell rang and students shuffled around us, oblivious to the quiet unraveling happening a few feet away. Ernest stood slowly, bracing himself against the back of the chair. We need to check one more place, he said. Somewhere I didn't think to look yesterday. Somewhere that connects both timelines. Where? I asked. His eyes met mine with a clarity I hadn't seen since this began. My classroom, he said. Not the desk. The back of the room. Why the back? Because in the future, he said, that's where I saw something I didn't understand. And I think, now I do. He started walking before I could ask what he meant. And for the first time since this started, I felt certain that whatever he was about to show me was going to change everything. Ernest walked with more intention than I'd seen in days. Not hurried, not frantic, just steady, as if some quiet thread was pulling him toward a moment he'd been circling without quite reaching. I followed him through the hallways, passing students who barely glanced up as we moved by. The school felt strangely split that afternoon, like half of it belonged to the present and the other half was leaning toward something it wasn't ready to show. When we reached his classroom, the hallway had emptied again. A soft hum from the heating vents filled the silence. Ernest pushed open the door and stepped inside, not bothering to turn on the lights. The dim gray glow from the overcast sky outside was enough. He walked straight to the back of the room. I stayed near the door for a moment, watching him. The way he moved was different. Not nervous, not unsure, but searching for something he believed would be exactly where he remembered it, even though he'd only seen it in a timeline he wasn't meant to enter. "What are you looking for?" I asked quietly. He ran his fingers along the back wall, just above the row of coat hooks students rarely used anymore. "In the future," he said. "There was a mark here, something small, faint. I thought it was just wear and tear. And now? Now I think it was a sign, something left behind." He stepped back and squinted, adjusting his glasses slightly. "There," he murmured. I moved closer. At first, I didn't see anything, just the same smooth paint that had been there since the late 80s. But when Ernest lifted the blinds with one hand and let a thin slice of gray daylight hit the wall, something emerged. A faint indentation, almost nothing, like the pressure of a pencil pressed too softly to leave color. A single line, curved slightly, subtle enough to vanish unless you looked directly at it. "That could have been anything," I said, though even as I spoke I wasn't convinced. "It wasn't there before," Ernest replied quietly. "Not in this timeline." A chill ran down the back of my neck. Not fear, just the strange awareness that something invisible had brushed past us. "What do you think made it?" I asked. He hesitated. "In the future, I remember hearing a sound. Soft, like someone dragging something across the wall. I didn't pay attention then. But now, seeing this in our present..." He exhaled slowly. "I think Ryan was here. In the future version, yes. And this," I gestured at the faint mark, "is what he left behind." "I think so, or at least, some version of him did." We stood together in the quiet, staring at a mark so small it shouldn't have mattered. But it did, because it shouldn't have been there at all. "Stephen," Ernest said suddenly, voice low. "Yesterday, when I stepped out of alignment for a moment, when the hallway shifted, I didn't tell you everything I heard." I turned toward him fully. "Tell me now." He looked down at his hands, then at the empty space beside the back wall, as though expecting something to be standing there. "I heard a voice," he said quietly. "Just a word, maybe two, faint, like it was coming from the wrong side of a closed door. And I recognized it." "Ryan?" I asked. He shook his head. "Older," he whispered. "Tired, like someone who'd lived longer than the boy we know." The air in the room seemed to sink, heavier somehow. "What did the voice say?" I asked. He hesitated again, not to protect me, but because he was still trying to understand it himself. "It said, 'Not here.'" A subtle ripple of unease moved through me, not sharp, just cold. "Not here," I repeated, as in, he's not here right now. "Or that he wasn't supposed to be," Ernest said. "Or that he left. I don't know." But the voice wasn't confused. It was certain. We both stood there, letting the meaning settle. Whatever version of Ryan existed in that future, whatever he had been trying to say, he hadn't returned home that night. And now, in our timeline, he hadn't come to school either. A thin gust of wind pushed against the classroom windows, rattling them softly. "We need to find him," Ernest said. "We don't know where to start," I replied. "If he's caught between two moments or moving through whatever you moved through." "I know," he said, "but he left a note, and he left a mark. He's trying to reach us." He stepped closer to the faint line on the wall, tracing it with his finger without touching it. "And I'm starting to think," he added softly, "that this isn't just about his future." His voice dropped lower. "It's about mine, too." That evening, after the school emptied and the hallways settled into their usual after-hours stillness, I stayed longer than I planned. Ernest had already left, but something kept me wandering the corridors. Some quiet instinct that told me the day wasn't finished with me yet. The winter light outside was fading fast, the windows turning from gray to blue to nearly black. I walked past classrooms with their doors half open, lights off, chairs stacked. Everything looked ordinary, but it no longer felt ordinary. I eventually found myself near Ernest's classroom again. The building hummed faintly, the heating system working against the early cold settling in from outside. When I stepped inside the room, the air felt different from the rest of the school, cooler but not in a physical way. More like the quiet had weight. The faint mark on the back wall was still there. It seemed even subtler now in the dim light, but I could still make it out. A small, curved indentation, insignificant to anyone who didn't know the story behind it. I walked toward it slowly, as if approaching something alive. I thought about Ryan, about Ernest's voice describing the future he'd stepped into, about the note that had appeared in the desk drawer, folded with the precision of a boy unsure whether he wanted to be heard or forgotten. I didn't go home. I didn't know if those words were meant for Ernest or for anyone who happened to find them, or if they were meant for a version of us that had never existed. The strange part was how normal everything looked, how easy it would have been to believe nothing unusual was happening. But the emptiness in the building felt different now, like a space waiting for someone who wasn't going to arrive. I was about to leave the room when I noticed something new. One of the desks, second row, near the center, was slightly out of line with the others. I had been in this classroom too many times not to notice. Ernest kept his room neat, almost ritualistically so. That single desk pushed back a few inches didn't fit. I stepped closer and gently nudged it forward, aligning it with the others. That's when I noticed the paper beneath it. Flat, partially tucked under the metal frame, barely visible. My chest tightened. I crouched down and pulled it out carefully. A single sheet folded once this time. Not the crisp, purposeful folds of the previous note, but something quicker, like someone had only a moment to place it before leaving. My hands hesitated before opening it. Inside, written in the same handwriting Ernest had recognized, were 3 words. Stay with him. My breath caught. The message was smaller this time, the lines less steady, as though written in a rush. This can't be real, I whispered, but I knew it was. I knew the moment I saw the slant of the letters, the pressure of the pen in the first stroke. Ryan had written this, or some version of him had, and whoever he was speaking to, past, future, or something in between, it was clear he feared Ernest being alone. I felt a sudden urgency rise in my chest. I grabbed my coat and headed out of the classroom, my footsteps echoing down the empty hallway. The sky outside was nearly black now, the last smear of evening fading behind the school roof. The parking lot lights flickered on, scattering weak pools of yellow across the asphalt. When I reached my car, I hesitated. I should have gone home. A normal day would have ended there, but nothing about this was normal anymore. Instead, I drove to Ernest's house. It wasn't far, just a quiet neighborhood on the edge of town with older homes, the kind where porches creaked and yards blended into the open fields behind them. His lights were on. A single lamp glowed in the front window. When he answered the door, I didn't give him time to ask questions. I found something in your classroom, I said. He stiffened. Another note? I nodded and handed it to him. He unfolded it slowly, his breath steady until he saw the words. Then he closed his eyes. Stephen, he said softly, I think he's trying to keep me from disappearing. The room felt suddenly smaller, the air heavier. Disappear? I asked. Ernest looked at me, not afraid but resigned, as if he had already accepted a possibility I was only beginning to understand. I think, he said quietly, that in the future I wasn't gone. He paused, voice tightening. I think I was lost. And standing in his doorway, with the cold night pushing against our backs, I felt something shift in me too. A quiet realization that whatever was coming next would test more than just Ernest's future. It would test mine as well. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Ernest stood in the doorway, holding the small note between his fingers, the paper trembling just slightly from the weight he was putting on it. The lamp behind him cast a warm, soft glow that didn't match the heaviness in his voice. I stepped inside quietly, and he closed the door behind us as if afraid that even the cold outside might try to take something from him. He walked toward the living room, each step slow and deliberate. His house felt exactly like the man himself. Calm, neat, built from years of steady routines. Shelves filled with old books, a framed diploma, a small clock ticking softly in the corner. Nothing out of place, nothing strange. And yet the air carried a quiet tension, like the house was waiting for something it couldn't name. I sat in the armchair by the window while Ernest lowered himself into the couch. He placed the note on the coffee table gently, as though it might vanish if handled too roughly. "You said you think you weren't gone in that future," I said. "Just lost. What does that mean?" Ernest's eyes drifted to the window, though the glass reflected only darkness. "When I walked through that future," he said slowly, "I didn't feel like someone missing. I felt misplaced, as if I had stepped out of my own life and into the space between moments." He rubbed his palms together, something he rarely did unless he was deeply unsettled. "I think whatever took me forward could take someone else too," he added, "and I think Ryan might be slipping into the same space." I leaned forward. "Because of what you told him? Years ago?" "Because I pushed him off the path he wanted," Ernest said. "And when I stepped forward in time, I saw the version of him built from that moment. The boy who listened, the boy who stayed, the boy who tried to shrink himself into the shape I handed him." His voice cracked only once, almost too quietly to notice. "And now," he continued, "the versions of him are bleeding into each other. The one who stayed, the one who left, the one who didn't go home, the one who wrote that note in my desk years from now. They're overlapping, and I don't think he's fully anchored to this moment anymore." I felt a tightness in my chest. "Do you think Ryan is safe?" Ernest hesitated. "I think he's calling out," he said, trying to keep me from stepping off the edge the way he did. The room fell silent except for the steady ticking of the clock. Outside, the wind grew stronger, rattling the branches against the window. It sounded almost like knocking. "What do we do?" I asked. Ernest's expression softened into something tired but resolute. "I need to go back to the school," he said. "Tonight. You think you'll find him there?" He shook his head. "I think the school is where everything began, and where everything ends. That future I saw, it didn't follow me to town. It stayed in those hallways, in that classroom, in the space where the note was left. I stood. Then I'm going with you." Ernest looked at me for a long moment, the faintest flicker of gratitude passing through his eyes. "You don't have to." "I know," I said, "but the note said to stay with you. Whoever wrote it knew what mattered." He exhaled slowly, not a sigh, more like surrender to something he'd been resisting. We left his house together and drove in separate cars, though the quiet road made it feel like the night belonged only to the two of us. The town was almost entirely dark, the kind of darkness that feels heavier in winter, where even the streetlights seem to keep their distance. When we reached the school parking lot, both cars idled for a moment before we stepped out. Snow had begun falling lightly, drifting in thin flakes that caught the dim light from the building's exterior lamps. The school looked different at night, large, empty, holding its breath. Ernest stood beside me, staring at the entrance. "If time shifts again," he said softly, "I don't know how long I'll stay on either side." "You're not going anywhere without me," I said. He nodded once, firmly. We walked toward the doors, and just before Ernest reached for the handle, a faint sound echoed from deep inside the building. Not footsteps, not a voice, a soft, fragile sound, paper unfolding. It came from somewhere in the dark, somewhere waiting for us. The sound came again, soft, careful, like someone unfolding a page in a library where silence was expected. Ernest and I exchanged a look, both of us frozen in place for a heartbeat. Then he slowly pushed open the door, and the click of the latch sounded louder than it should have in the quiet cold of the night. The hallway inside was dark, except for a single line of dim emergency lights that stretched along the ceiling. They cast long shadows across the floor, stretching into places we couldn't see. The school smelled different at night, cooler, emptier, the scent of dust settling after a long day. We stepped inside. The echo of our footsteps was swallowed too quickly, as though the building didn't want to give them back. Ernest's breathing grew shallow. He wasn't afraid, I could tell that much. What he felt went deeper than fear. It was recognition, as if he had walked this hallway in two different versions of his life and now stood at the seam between them. The sound of paper came again, this time a little farther down the corridor. Ernest began walking toward it without hesitation. I followed closely, my heartbeat loud enough that I was sure he could hear it too. When we reached the intersection where the hall split left and right, he stopped, his eyes fixed on the darkened end of the left corridor. "That's where I walked in the future," he said. "Right down there." We moved together, our steps slow, steady, the faint sound drawing us closer. When we passed the unused classroom in the west wing, the one with the dust-lined bottom edge of the door, Ernest hesitated, his eyes drifting toward it. "Do you hear it now?" I asked. He shook his head. "No, but I feel something, like this place is remembering." We continued until we reached his classroom. The door was slightly open. We hadn't left it that way. Ernest pushed it gently. It swung inward with a soft creak, revealing a room washed in faint bluish light from the snow outside. The desks were exactly as we'd left them earlier, except one, the desk where I had found the second note. It was pulled farther back now, angled slightly toward the window. A piece of paper fluttered beneath it. This one wasn't folded at all. It lay flat on the floor, the edges trembling slightly from the draft sneaking in through the window frame. Ernest walked to it slowly, each step deliberate. He crouched down and picked it up. I kneeled beside him. There were 4 words again, but not the same ones. He followed me here. My stomach tightened. Ernest's eyes scanned the paper, then the room, then the door, as if expecting someone or something to appear in the threshold. "He," I whispered. "Ryan?" Ernest swallowed hard. "Or the version of him that wrote the note in the future." The air grew colder. Not a temperature shift. Something else. Something quieter. The hair on my arms lifted beneath my sleeves. "What does this mean?" I asked. "I think Ryan, or whatever version of him exists between these timelines, is being pulled through them. Not all at once, in pieces." Ernest held the note lightly, turning it just enough to see the tremble of his own hands. "And he's trying to tell us something before he slips any farther." A sudden flicker of movement caught my eye, the faintest shadow against the back wall. A soft, shifting outline, there for half a second, then gone. "Did you see that?" I asked, rising to my feet. Ernest stood slowly. I did. The shadow hadn't moved like a person. It hadn't moved like anything physical. It was more like a moment, something passing between 2 points in time, brushing against the present before fading out again. A faint knock echoed from the hallway. One single knock. We both turned. The hallway was empty, but not silent. There was a soft rhythmic sound now, like faint footsteps, but delayed, as if they were arriving seconds after they were made. Ernest stepped forward. "Stephen." His voice was low, steady, but full of something heavy. "I think the boundary is thinning." "What boundary?" I asked, though the question felt unnecessary. "Between the time I walked into," Ernest said, "and the time that's trying to form now. The future is changing, and it's pressing against this place." "And Ryan?" I asked. Ernest looked down at the note, his expression tightening. "He's somewhere between them," he said softly, "trying to keep from being lost completely." The footsteps stopped. The hallway fell silent. Then a voice, thin, distant, strained, echoed faintly down the corridor. Not a word, just a sound. A quiet, broken version of a name. "Mr. Campbell." Ernest's breath caught. It was Ryan's voice, but in a tone neither of us had ever heard from him. Not fear, not pain, something closer to distance, as if he were speaking from the wrong side of time. Ernest didn't move when he heard his name. He just stood in the doorway of his classroom, eyes fixed on the empty hallway, as if the voice might still be hanging in the air. I stood beside him, waiting for something, another sound, a shadow, a sign that the moment hadn't slipped away. But the building settled back into silence so complete it felt unnatural, the kind of stillness that follows something you weren't meant to hear. We walked the hall in careful steps, listening, calling Ryan's name once, twice, 3 times. Nothing answered. The faint trail of footsteps we had heard earlier was gone, leaving no echo, no clue. It was as if time itself had folded over the moment and smoothed it flat. When we returned to Ernest's classroom, the note still lay on the desk where he'd placed it. He followed me here. The words looked smaller now, almost fading, like the ink had aged in the short time we'd been gone. Ernest touched the corner of the paper gently, the way someone touches a door they're not sure they should open. "I don't think he's lost," Ernest said quietly. "Not completely. I think he's trying to stay close to wherever we are." His voice wasn't hopeful. It was reflective, steady, like he was speaking to a truth he didn't yet understand. I didn't know what to say. The school felt different around us, as if the building itself were shifting its weight, an old structure holding a new shape. We left the room together, turning off the lights and closing the door behind us. The lock clicked softly, almost respectfully. Outside, snow drifted under the parking lot lamps, falling in slow, uneven flakes. As we walked into the quiet night, I realized something simple and heavy. Whatever future Ernest had seen wasn't final, and whatever was happening to Ryan hadn't finished with us yet.